Biographical Memoir of Mr. Liston by Charles Lamb. The subject of our memoir is lineally descended from Johann de Liston, see Domesday Book, where he is so written, who came in with the Conqueror, and had lands awarded him at Lupton Magna, in Kent. His particular merits or services, Fabian, whose authority I chiefly follow, has forgotten, or perhaps thought it immaterial to specify. Fuller thinks that he was standard-bearer to Hugo de Agmundesham, a powerful Norman baron, who was slain by the hand of Harold himself at the fatal Battle of Hastings. Be this as it may, we find a family of that name flourishing some centuries later in that county. John Deliston Knight was High Sheriff for Kent, according to Fabian Quinto Henrici Sexti, and we trace the lineal branch flourishing downwards, the orthography varying, according to the unsettled usage of the times, from Deliston to Leston or Liston, between which it seems to have alternated, till, in the latter end of the reign of James I, it finally settled into the determinate and pleasing dissyllabic arrangement which it still retains. Aminadab Liston, the eldest male representative of the family of that day, was of the strictest order of Puritans. Mr. Foss of Pall Mall has obligingly communicated to me an undoubted tract of his, which bears the initials only, A.L., and is entitled, The Grinning Glass, or Actor's Mirror, wherein the vituperative visnomy of vicious players for the scene is as virtuously reflected back upon their mimetic monstrosities as it has viciously, hitherto, vitiated with its vile vanities her votarists. A strange title, but bearing the impress of those absurdities with which the title pages of that pamphlet-spawning age abounded. The work bears date 1617. It preceded the Histriomastix by 15 years, and as it went before it in time, so it comes not far short of it in virulence. It is amusing to find an ancestor of Liston's thus bespattering the players at the commencement of the 17th century. Thinketh he, the actor, with his costive countenances, to wry a sorrowing soul out of her anguish, or by defacing the divine denotement of destinate dignity, daintily described in the pg 293 face humane, and no other, to reinstamp the paradise-plotted similitude with a novel and naughty approximation, not in the first intention to those abhorred and ugly God-forbidden correspondences, with flouting apes jeering gibberings and babian babbling like, to hoot out of countenance all modest measure, as if our sins were not sufficing to stoop our backs without he resting and crooking his members to mistimed mirth, rather malice, in deformed fashion, leering when he should learn, prating for praying, goggling his eyes better upturned for grace, whereas in paradise, if we can go thus high for his profession, that devilish serpent appeareth his undoubted predecessor, first in doing a mask like some roguish roistering Roscius, I spit at them all to beguile with stage shows the gaping woman, whose sex hath still chiefly upheld these mysteries, and are voiced to be the chief stage haunters, where, as I am told, the custom is commonly to mumble between axe apples, not ambiguously derived from that pernicious pippin, worse in effect than the apples of discord, whereas sometimes the hissing sounds of displeasure, as I hear, do lively reintonate that snake-taking leave, and diabolical goings-off in paradise. The puritanic effervescence of the early Presbyterians appears to have abated with time, and the opinions of the more immediate ancestors of our subject to have subsided at length into a strain of moderate Calvinism. Still a tincture of the old leaven was to be expected among the posterity of A. Our hero was an only son of Habakkuk Liston, settled as an Anabaptist minister upon the patrimonial soil of his ancestors. A regular certificate appears, thus entered in the church book at Lupton Magna. Johannes, filius Habakkuk et Rebek Liston, descentium, natus quinto Decembri, 1780, baptizatus sexto Februarii sequentis. Sponsoribus J. et W. Wollaston, unicum Maria Merriweather. The singularity of an Anabaptist minister conforming to the child rights of the church would have tempted me to doubt the authenticity of this entry, had I not been obliged with the actual sight of it, by the favor of Mr. Minns, the intelligent and worthy parish clerk of Lupton. Possibly some expectation in point of worldly advantages from some of the sponsors might have induced this unseemly deviation, as it must have appeared, from the practice and principles of that generally rigid sect. The term descentium was possibly intended by the orthodox pg 294 clergyman as a slur upon the supposed inconsistency. What, or of what nature, the expectations we have hinted at, may have been, we have now no means of ascertaining. Of the Wollastons no trace is now discoverable in the village. The name of Merriweather occurs over the front of a grocer's shop at the western extremity of Lupton. Of the infant Liston, we find no events recorded before his 4th year, in which a severe attack of the measles bid fair to have robbed the rising generation of a fund of innocent entertainment. He had it of the confluent kind, as it is called, and the child's life was for a week or two despaired of. His recovery he always attributes, under heaven, to the humane interference of one Dr. Wilhelm Richter, a German empiric, who, in this extremity, prescribed a copious diet of sauerkraut, which the child was observed to reach at with avidity when other food repelled him. And from this change of diet, his restoration was rapid and complete. We have often heard him name the circumstance with gratitude, and it is not altogether surprising that a relish for this kind of aliment, so abhorrent and harsh to common English palates, has accompanied him through life. When any of Mr. Liston's intimates invite him to supper, he never fails of finding, nearest to his knife and fork, a dish of sauerkraut. At the age of 9, we find our subject under the tuition of the Rev. Mr. Goodenough, his father's health not permitting him probably to instruct him himself, by whom he was inducted into a competent portion of Latin and Greek, with some mathematics, till the death of Mr. Goodenough, in his own 70th, and Master Liston's 11th year, put a stop for the present to his classical progress. We have heard our hero with emotions, which do his heart honor, describe the awful circumstances attending the decease of this worthy old gentleman. It seems they had been walking out together, master and pupil, in a fine sunset, to the distance of 3/4 of a mile west of Lupton, when a sudden curiosity took Mr. Goodenough to look down upon a chasm, where a shaft had been lately sunk in a mining speculation, then projecting, but abandoned soon after as not answering the promised success, by Sir Ralph Shepperton, knight and member for the county. The old clergyman leaning over, either with incaution or sudden giddiness, probably a mixture of both, suddenly lost his footing, and to pg 295 use Mr. Liston's phrase, disappeared, and was doubtless broken into 1,000 pieces. The sound of his head and sea, dashing successively upon the projecting masses of the chasm, had such an effect upon the child, that a serious sickness ensued, and even for many years after his recovery, he was not once seen so much as to smile. The joint deaths of both his parents, which happened not many months after this disastrous accident, and were probably one or both of them accelerated by it, threw our youth upon the protection of his maternal great-aunt, Mrs. Sittingbourne. Of this aunt we have never heard him speak, but with expressions amounting almost to reverence. To the influence of her early counsels and manners, he has always attributed the firmness with which, in maturer years, thrown upon a way of life, commonly not the best adapted to gravity and self-retirement, he has been able to maintain a serious character, untinctured with the levities incident to his profession. Anne Sittingbourne, we have seen her portrait by Hudson, was stately, stiff, tall, with a cast of features strikingly resembling the subject of this memoir. Her estate in Kent was spacious and well-wooded. The house, one of those venerable old mansions which are so impressive in childhood and so hardly forgotten in succeeding years. In the venerable solitudes of Charnwood, among thick shades of the oak and beech, this last his favorite tree, the young Liston cultivated those contemplative habits which have never entirely deserted him in after years. Here he was commonly in the summer months to be met with a book in his hand, not a playbook, meditating. Boyle's Reflections was at one time the darling volume, which in its turn was superseded by Young's Night Thoughts, which has continued its hold upon him through life. He carries it always about him, and it is no uncommon thing for him to be seen, in the refreshing intervals of his occupation, leaning against a side scene, in a sort of Herbert of Cherbury posture, turning over a pocket edition of his favorite author. But the solitudes of Charnwood were not destined always to obscure the path of our young hero. The premature death of Mrs. Sittingbourne, at the age of 70, occasioned by incautious burning of a pot of charcoal in her sleeping chamber, left him in his 19th year nearly without resources. That the stage at all should have presented itself as an eligible scope pg 296 for his talents, and in particular, that he should have chosen a line so foreign to what appears to have been his turn of mind, may require some explanation. At Charnwood then we behold him thoughtful, grave, ascetic, from his cradle averse to flesh meats and strong drink, abstemious even beyond the genius of the place, and almost in spite of the remonstrances of his great aunt, who, though strict, was not rigid. Water was his habitual drink, and his food little beyond the mast and beech nuts of his favorite groves. It is a medical fact that this kind of diet, however favorable to the contemplative powers of the primitive hermits, and is but ill adapted to the less robust minds and bodies of a later generation. Hypochondria almost constantly ensues. It was so in the case of the young Liston. He was subject to sights and had visions. Those arid beech nuts, distilled by a complexion naturally adust, mounted into an occiput, already prepared to kindle by long seclusion and the fervor of strict Calvinistic notions. In the glooms of Charnwood he was assailed by illusions, similar in kind to those which are related of the famous Anthony of Padua. Wild antic faces would ever and anon protrude themselves upon his sensorium. Whether he shut his eyes or kept them open, the same illusions operated. The darker and more profound were his cogitations, the droller and more whimsical became the apparitions. They buzzed about him thick as flies, flapping at him, flouting him, hooting in his ear, yet with such comic appendages, that what at first was his bane became at length his solace, and he desired no better society than that of his merry phantasmata. We shall presently find in what way this remarkable phenomenon influenced his future destiny. On the death of Mrs. Sittingbourne, we find him received into the family of Mr. Willoughby, an eminent Turkey merchant, resident in Birchin Lane, London. We lose a little while here the chain of his history, by what inducements this gentleman was determined to make him an inmate of his house. Probably he had had some personal kindness for Mrs. Sittingbourne formerly, but however it was, the young man was here treated more like a son than a clerk, though he was nominally but the latter. Different avocations, the change of scene, with that alternation of business and recreation, which in its greatest perfection is to be had only in PG 297 London, appear to have weaned him in a short time from the hypochondriacal affections which had beset him at Charnwood. In the 3 years which followed his removal to Birchin Lane, we find him making more than one voyage to the Levant, as chief factor for Mr. Willoughby at the port. We could easily fill our biography with the pleasant passages which we have heard him relate as having happened to him at Constantinople, such as his having been taken up on suspicion of a design of penetrating the seraglio, and But, with the deepest convincement of this gentleman's own veracity, we think that some of the stories are of that whimsical, and others of that romantic nature, which, however diverting, would be out of place in a narrative of this kind, which aims not only at strict truth, but at avoiding the very appearance of the contrary. We will now bring him over the seas again, and suppose him in the counting-house in Birchin Lane, his protector satisfied with the returns of his factorage, and all going on so smoothly that we may expect to find Mr. Liston at last an opulent merchant upon 'Change, as it is called. But see the turns of destiny. Upon a summer's excursion into Norfolk, in the year 1801, the accidental sight of pretty Sally Parker, as she was called, then in the Norwich Company, diverted his inclinations at once from commerce, and he became, in the language of commonplace biography, stage-struck. Happy for the lovers of mirth was it that our hero took this turn. He might else have been to this hour that unentertaining character, a plodding London merchant. We accordingly find him shortly after making his debut, as it is called, upon the Norwich boards, in the season of that year, being then in the 22d year of his age. Having a natural bent to tragedy, he chose the part of Pyrrhus in The Distressed Mother, to Sally Parker's Hermione. We find him afterwards as Barnwell, Altamont, Chamont, and But, as if nature had destined him to the sock, an unavoidable infirmity absolutely discapacitated him for tragedy. His person at this latter period, of which I have been speaking, was graceful and even commanding, his countenance set to gravity. He had the power of arresting the attention of an audience at first sight almost beyond any other tragic actor. But he could not hold it. To understand this obstacle, we must go back a few years to those appalling reveries at Charnwood. Those illusions, PG 298, which had vanished before the dissipation of a less recluse life, and more free society, now in his solitary tragic studies, and amid the intense calls upon feeling incident to tragic acting, came back upon him with tenfold vividness. In the midst of some most pathetic passage, the parting of Jaffir with his dying friend, for instance, he would suddenly be surprised with a fit of violent horse laughter. While the spectators were all sobbing before him with emotion, suddenly one of those grotesque faces would peep out upon him, and he could not resist the impulse. A timely excuse once or twice served his purpose, but no audiences could be expected to bear repeatedly this violation of the continuity of feeling. He describes them, the illusions, as so many demons haunting him, and paralyzing every effect. Even now, I am told, he cannot recite the famous soliloquy in Hamlet, even in private, without immoderate bursts of laughter. However, what he had not force of reason sufficient to overcome, he had good sense enough to turn into emolument, and determined to make a commodity of his distemper. He prudently exchanged the buskin for the sock, and the illusions instantly ceased, or, if they occurred for a short season, by their very cooperation added a zest to his comic vein, some of his most catching faces being, as he expresses it, little more than transcripts and copies of those extraordinary phantasmata. We have now drawn out our hero's existence to the period when he was about to meet for the first time the sympathies of a London audience. The particulars of his success since have been too much before our eyes to render a circumstantial detail of them expedient. I shall only mention that Mr. Willoughby, his resentments having had time to subside, is at present one of the fastest friends of his old renegado factor, and that Mr. Liston's hopes of Miss Parker vanishing along with his unsuccessful suit to Melpomene, in the autumn of 1811 he married his present lady, by whom he has been blessed with one son, Philip, and two daughters, Anne and Augustina. PG 299.